Welcome to week 6, lesson 5 of the Adaptation Planning and Practices online course. Y'all are making it so far. Courtney and Maddie are your course leads, but these are the folks that you will interact with through other lectures or discussion groups. And you can learn more about our team at forestadaptation.org/team. So our agenda today includes a brief recap of step 4, then an introduction to step 5, where we'll learn about monitoring. At that point, I'll hand it over to walk you through a tutorial on how to use the workbook, and then they'll give us a summary of what's to be completed for homework before our next class. So last week we completed step 3, evaluating management objectives with climate change in mind. Y'all weighed the challenges and opportunities that climate change presents, and then you determined the feasibility of meeting your current management objectives under current management. So this week we'll identify appropriate climate change adaptation approaches and tactics that can help us respond to climate-related challenges and local site vulnerabilities that climate change presents. So under climate change, your system may look different in the future than what would be expected under normal conditions. And trying to maintain those conditions despite climate change might mean increasing resources or investing in strategies that might actually make the system more vulnerable to risk. So there are some trade-offs to assess and strategies to explore associated with the different routes that you might take. This is why adaptation menus can be handy. They're a list of possible actions that allows you to decide what is most relevant for a particular location and set of conditions. So for step 4, you'll be using the Adaptation Strategies and Approaches menu, which can be found embedded in your workbook, or you can find it in chapters 3 and 4 of the Forest Adaptation Resources document. And there are a lot of benefits to adaptation menus, one of them being connecting those broad ideas related to climate change and adaptation into specific actions. And that specificity helps make our actions more intentional. They also give you language to help communicate your ideas and create more ideas that help boost creativity. It gives you ideas to think outside of the box. And adaptation actions may not look that different from current management actions, especially in the near term. So very rarely, they might just be small tweaks that improve effectiveness. Even more rarely, there are those new and different actions that some may consider as completely bananas. But most commonly, it's just the same actions you've been taking. But because of climate change, it just makes them that much more important. When thinking about adaptation, we like to think about these broad adaptation options: resistance, resilience, and transition. So resistance and resilience, they try to foster persistence of the current system, where you are maintaining those conditions and characteristics and trying to reduce impact. Whereas transition, you're intentionally facilitating change, transforming the current system into a different ecosystem with different characteristics. Transition is good for those highly vulnerable ecosystems, which might experience a range of future climates. While maintaining conditions might seem ideal, like you might have in resilience and resistance, like we talked about, there might be times when the risks to maintain these systems are just too great. So as you explore the adaptation menus, try to think about which strategies and approaches reduce impacts and maintain current conditions, and which ones are more forward-looking, where you're intentionally facilitating change in your local project. And so now we're going to take this time to break out into breakout groups. I'll hand it over to Courtney to guide this part of our lecture.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Maud, and for the recap of thinking about adaptation strategies and approaches and tactics. And so now what we're going to do, as Maud said, is we're going to split it up into our breakout groups, and we're going to take about another 35-ish minutes for our discussion today. We have mixed up the breakout groups just a little bit so that you can start to share some of the adaptation actions you're coming up with other projects. So that you're not just stuck talking to the same people that you have been the last couple of weeks. And so in our breakout groups, there will be a facilitator from the Southwest Climate Hub or NIAX in each group again. And some of the key questions that we want to ask this time are really, what adaptation actions are you considering? So as you've been working your way through the adaptation workbook process and have gotten to step 4, what are some of those key strategies and approaches and tactics that you've been thinking about that have really excited you and that you're really excited to try in your projects? And then also, are they addressing your major impacts or challenges that you identified in step 3? So are they really taking advantage of those climate change opportunities? And are they really starting to address some of those big challenges that we discussed last week? And then we'll come back and we'll do a large group poll, and we'll talk about, do you really think that your actions fall under resistance, resilience, transition, or a combination of all 3? And so that's kind of the scope of what we'll be doing in our breakout groups. And I think I've got everyone assigned. And so with that, we're going to split into our breakout groups. So everyone should be able to join. And we'll come back at 9:45-ish. Okay, there we go. All right, so what we want to do is just have a quick poll and see what you were thinking about the adaptation actions that you've been thinking about for all of your projects. And so again, thinking about resistance, resilience, or transition, or a combination of all of them. And so there are 2 questions. The first one is really asking, what categories would you say your identified actions fall into? Are they things you're already doing, things that are part of your current management plan? Or are they tweaks or modifications to your planned actions? Or are they really some new or different actions that you think you might implement? Or are there some that you identified but are deciding not to recommend because of challenges that you're facing at your project location? So go ahead and fill out that poll. And then the second question is asking, what categories would you say your identified actions fall into? Is it more resistance, resilience, transition, in between, or a mix of all 3, or none? Or maybe you think resistance is futile and we really need to be doing more of that resilience transition end of the spectrum. So go ahead and take another minute to fill out that poll. Awesome. It looks like we're getting the answers in. I'll give you all just a couple more seconds for those of you who haven't voted. All right. That looks great. So for that first question, it looks like for the majority of you, a lot of the actions are tweaks or modifications to actions you already had planned. And that I think is pretty consistent with what I was hearing in some of the discussions as well. Or some of the actions are already part of your current management plan. And so hopefully this process is just helping you really show your intentionality and connect those dots from your goals and objectives to your climate change impacts to those actions you're deciding to implement as a part of your management plans. And then about 40% said those actions are new and different. And then going on to that second question, it looks like the majority of you said that your actions are a mix of all three: resistance, resilience, and transition. So would anyone be willing to share what you were thinking, whether it's your actions are already a part of your current management plan, or there's some small tweaks or modifications, or you're doing a mix of all three: resistance, resilience, and transition for your projects? Or any insights that you would like to share with the larger group about going through step 4?
I'll share for the Kaho'olawe group. So our tactics fall in all three: resistance, resilience, and transition. And that's just the nature of the space that we're working in. An example of resistance is when we're trying to fight back the invasives that have taken extreme footholds in certain places, and like Kiawe or Halikoa along the roads that get spread from our tires and things like that. So we're constantly trying to cut those guys back and reduce that. Resilience, tweaking our current mechanisms to be adaptive to what our current situation provides. So the example I can give in that is, when we had some CIP funding, we were able to hire a UXO tech to go walk out on the hard pan and find a line with no explosives hidden underground. And then we could lay out irrigation along that line and dig auger holes and put 600 plants in one day with 20 volunteers, up there, and water them for a year, and they'd really take a good hold and start to seed and put out keiki all next to them in our, catchment, our dam checks and our check dams and places where we're catching soil. But we don't have that money anymore, nor do we have the volunteers because of COVID. So we've had to amend our tactics to planting in naturally sedimented wadis, smaller cracks and crevices in the area that are already getting water during rain events and have soil and a space for the plants to have some shelter. Transition would be that example, though, again, with the hard pan, right? We're taking a rock, a huge expanse of rock, and we're transforming it into a dryland forest. It used to be a dryland forest before the goats transformed it into a rock. So it's been it's going through a second transition. But yeah, so our projects always have elements of all three of those things. It's just the nature of Kaho'olawe Kanaloa.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing, Maggie. It's really cool to see examples of that mix of the resistance, resilience, and transition, and how you've really brought in all of those different concepts into your management planning, especially thinking about your restoration efforts on Kaho'olawe. So thank you. In our group too, in group 2, we had a lot of discussion around rain catchment systems and how hard it is to do that restoration from pasture lands to native trees. And so I think, is anyone willing to share some of your thoughts around that, or if there's any good ideas or suggestions for some of those different ways to be thinking about those rain catchment systems? If not, that's okay. But if you have other ideas, please do put those into the chat, because I think we could have some good discussion about that as well. And then there was one person who said resistance is futile. And I was just curious what you were thinking since you picked that option.
Oh, well, one, I thought that was a funny throwback to a sci-fi show. So I clicked on it, enjoyed reading that in there. But I I I do have an issue with the resistance concept, because wrapped up in that is this idea that ecosystems are I don't know how to say this exactly, but they're akin to a superorganism of this collection of organisms that are kind of highly interdependent upon each other. And I think a lot of research has shown that isn't exactly true, that they're always changing, they're always dynamic, and that individual species responses play a big role. So yeah, so I think the resistance concept seems to apply to kind of that conception of what an ecosystem is, but I don't know if that's necessarily true.
Thanks for sharing, Elliot. Does anybody want to respond to that or reactions to that? I think it's an interesting point, and it's something that comes up in a lot of the adaptation workshops that we do, because especially with climate change, as we're seeing us move towards some of those higher emission scenarios, and we know that everything is interrelated and our systems are constantly being exposed to these extreme impacts. Does it make sense to still try to maintain the current composition and structure and function of an ecosystem into the future? And so that is like an interesting discussion, I think, that comes up, and I don't have an answer for that either, but I just think it's interesting food for thought. So thanks again, Elliot, for sharing your thinking and for that sci-fi reference as well. Any other feedback or comments before we move on? All right, I am not hearing anything. So now what we want to do is transition into step 5. And so at this point, this is the last step in our adaptation workbook process. We've started all the way with defining our goals and objectives, assessed our climate change impacts, evaluated those impacts and the challenges and opportunities that they create for management. Last week, we really started thinking about step 4 and identifying those different adaptation approaches and actions. And now what we want to do is really wrap it up with monitoring. And so how are we really going to evaluate the effectiveness of our implemented actions moving forward? And so a few thoughts on monitoring. Monitoring is really about being extremely clear about our goals and objectives and making sure that the questions that we ask can help guide our monitoring approaches. And so it's really, again, about asking that right question that's going to help you detect your desired conditions over time and make sure that the actions we're implementing on the ground really meet our goals and objectives that we want to achieve. And so there's different ways we can do monitoring and different approaches to monitoring. One of them is scientific research as a monitoring tool. And so maybe we have a question or a hypothesis, and with replication, we can really judge some of that deviation from that hypothesis through time. We don't typically do that when we're thinking about adaptation planning, but it is a good thing to consider, especially with the connections we have to the different universities. If there are some scientific research questions and partners we could be tapping into when it comes to doing adaptation planning, and really using some of that graduate student expertise to help us answer some of our questions and think about monitoring our adaptation actions into the future. Another type of monitoring is that impact or response monitoring. And so this is really looking at what changes are occurring over time. But this monitoring kind of consists of repeated measurements done to specific standards. So for example, we could use stocking surveys to measure growth, or canopy cover or ground cover or survival of planted seedlings. Phenology monitoring is a great example of response monitoring, where you might want to record the dates of leaf out or of bird arrival every spring. And this type of monitoring usually attempts to answer a particular question that's relevant to your management goals. But this type of monitoring can be expensive and time consuming. So it's good to, again, with impact or response monitoring, piggyback on existing inventories or surveys or other monitoring research that's already taking place. And then we have implementation monitoring, which is really asking, did we do the action that we wanted to implement? And this can be really useful if we're implementing an action because of climate change and we want to monitor the execution of that change over time. And so this can often be observation monitoring as well. Did we, yes or no, implement that action? And then finally, that fourth type of monitoring is effectiveness monitoring. And when we're thinking about climate adaptation planning, this is really the type of monitoring that we're doing the most of. And so it's really, did our actions actually have the desired effect? Did it work and achieve what we wanted it to? And how will we know if it worked? And so, for example, maybe we're installing berms to slow the overland flow of water. And after some time, we want to determine, was the overland flow slowed because of those berms? Or is the downhill system less inundated? And so this type of monitoring is usually carefully designed based on a conceptual model of a system and supports the cause and effect over meaningful time periods and works really well for adaptation. And so these are just all kinds of different monitoring options that we can use, but really it's up to you to pick and choose the one that works the best for what your desired outcome is and what question you're really trying to answer through your adaptation work. And so in step 5 of the adaptation workbook, what we're really trying to do is monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of our implemented actions. And so really consider what existing monitoring efforts are already available. Do they need to be modified to better monitor the results of your adaptation actions and to really help us know if the selected actions are effective into the future under climate change? And then what can we learn from these actions to inform our future management? And so in step 5, what we're going to ask you to do is first define your monitoring variable. And so this is, what will you measure? And so really this is asking, what are some of those items that can tell you whether you have achieved your management goals and objectives? And if possible, use any monitoring items that will also help you evaluate your particular tactic or actions you're implementing on the ground. And so when possible, we really want to make sure that the adaptation tactics that are recommended in our step 4 were effective in working toward your management goals and objectives under climate change. So an example of a monitoring variable could be planted seedling survival. So if your action is to really underplant with future adapted species that are suitable for your system, you may choose to monitor the survival rate of those particular seedlings or saplings. And so this might be different from standard surveys that you're doing, or you might be able to tap into some other systems that are already monitoring seedling survival for this variable as well. So again, the first thing you want to do is identify, what are you measuring and what is your adaptation monitoring variable? The second thing we want you to do is identify your criteria for evaluation. And so this is really, what is the value or threshold that's meaningful for monitoring your variable? How are you really going to assess the effectiveness and inform your future decisions for management? And so this is really asking, what does success look like? And so what you're monitoring or measuring is really the units of your data that you're trying to capture through your monitoring. And so, for example, based on the example of monitoring the number of surviving seedlings, then what represents success? And so, for example, we could say that having a criteria of 60% survival of those future adapted native species represents success. And then finally, how are you implementing your monitoring? How are you actually going to gather your information moving forward? And so how are you going to actually track what's getting done on the ground? And so this is where you can really take advantage of some of those existing monitoring efforts already taking place where possible. And so maybe for monitoring those future adapted seedling survivals, you're going to do regular post-planting stocking surveys, or maybe, and then have supplemental surveys that take place every 10 years after that to see how the seedlings are surviving into the future. And so just a few more examples, pulling this all together. Say that you want to really keep track of invasive species control. That would be your adaptation monitoring variable. And then a criteria for evaluation to know whether or not you're successful at controlling those invasive species is maybe in your area, less than 20% of the cover has been impacted by invasive species when you go to monitor. And then your implementation plan is doing annual invasive species surveys in the late fall every year. So that's one example of, again, the 3 things that we're asking for when you're thinking about monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of your implemented actions. But ultimately, the main thing that we want you to think about are what are realistic and feasible monitoring plans that you can use to help determine whether your management should be altered in the future to account for new information and observations that you're making through your monitoring efforts. And so again, you've seen this graphic before, but the point of this is to really connect the dots and show your intentionality of each step to really compile your climate-informed management plan. And so when we're thinking about monitoring, we can also work backwards for this process. And so as you're thinking about your monitoring plans, our metrics are directly linked to measure the effectiveness of our adaptation tactics, which describe how we're going to implement our strategies and our overall concepts of resistance, resilience, and transition. And then those actions we can trace back to the management challenges and opportunities that we're dealing with and that are directly impacting our ecosystems. And those are what we have identified our goals and objectives for. So again, monitoring ultimately helps us know whether we're on track to meet our management goals and objectives with the actions that we're implementing on the ground. And this is really that last step in that adaptive management process to really help us evaluate whether or not we're successful at doing that under climate change into the future. And so with that, I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions about monitoring, or if there's any suggestions that you already have, like Christian posted the active phenology monitoring in Hawaii. And so if there's other examples of that or monitoring networks that people should consider thinking about for your adaptation projects, please type those into the chat or share those as well. And then I saw Christian posted the Teaching Change Partnership has some easy to use methods for monitoring phenology. Christian, is there anything else you want to say about either of those 2 monitoring tools or networks that exist?
No, just the US Phenology Network has been a site where folks have been uploading phenology data for different native species for at least 8 years for some. And then the Teaching Change Partnership has kind of materials and methods that we use with middle and high school kids. And they're useful for doing the monitoring, but they're also cool educational resources. And I'd be happy to share those if people are interested.
Do you have to have an account with them? The link is not getting me anywhere. So I'm wondering, do you need to sign up for an account first before the link works, or?
I think you just need to delete that period at the end. Because when I clicked the direct link, it took me to that and I deleted the period and then refreshed it.
Okay. Didn't notice that, thanks.
Sorry about the period there. I did.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, now I'm getting somewhere. Okay.
Great.
And then Andy Gill also mentioned the NRDS database, which can record seedling survival. So that's another great tool that was posted in the chat. Thank you for sharing that. Do you have to pay anything for that since it's a subscription service?
Yeah, and I have to give credit to Yumi for insisting that we go with NERD's database, which is locally designed, and the management team is very responsive. Always can get some technical help, but it is a subscription service. We pay annually depending on how many users we have, and it's just really helpful out in the field. We're drawing all our trails and our 4x4 roads and our outplanting perimeters and thus and such. Anyway, it's colorful and easy to use and very responsive. When I say, oh, I need this, it happens. Anyway, there are free little tutorials and examples in there online.
That's perfect. Thank you for sharing that.
I guess I'll share one more quick thing about the some of the National Phenology Network protocols. If you have groups of volunteers who come in, let's say monthly or even quarterly, it's a fairly easy module to integrate into, say, a volunteer experience or an educational experience. It's a really fun way too for volunteers or students to become more connected with the site, especially if you can share previous people's data. Like just this picture here, observations that we make, National Phenology Network, you have these different stages of flowering, you have LECO, the new buds, and all of the different growth stages and flowering and fruiting stages are recorded, and students can kind of see changes over time. So it's a really cool educational opportunity as well.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that, Christian. The more opportunities that you have to partner with schools or universities who are already involved or learning about or are interested in learning about some of the adaptation work that you're doing and implementing on the ground, I think the better. So that's fantastic. Thank you. Anything else or other tools or resources or insights that people want to share about monitoring? Awesome. All right, so now, and if you do think of anything else as we're still going through, feel free to throw that into the chat. So I just wanted to wrap up with some pro tips for being in the adaptation workbook this week. And so again, what we're going to ask you to do is add a monitoring variable and apply it to your objectives. There's a really short homework section just asking about your experience with monitoring and if you feel like you can really track your adaptation actions on the ground. And then the last step in the workbook is to really export and share your plan. And so I'll show you kind of where you want to go to click to be able to do that this week. And so when you go into the adaptation workbook and you're pulled up to step 5, you'll see a little box that says add a monitoring variable. So you'll want to click on that, and then it'll pull up another pull-out box. And so this is where you can go in and add your monitoring variable, your criteria for evaluation. Again, what does success look like as you're monitoring? And then what is your implementation plan? So what does that look like, and how are you actually going to achieve your monitoring and implement it on the ground? And then you'll want to be sure that you save that. And then finally, you can associate it with your management objectives. And so you might have one monitoring variable that applies to all of your different management objectives, or you might want to pick and choose some different monitoring variables depending on your management goals and objectives and how they differ. And so you can click yes or no, this applies or this does not apply to this particular management objectives. And then finally, the last thing you'll want to do is export and share your plan so that you have a copy once you've gone through all of the steps in the adaptation workbook process. And so at the very bottom of that drop-down list on the left, you'll see export and share plan. And so you'll want to click on that, and then you can click on the print current version. And what that'll do is pull up a little box that says this climate adaptation plan has been formatted for printing in landscaping mode. You can just say okay. And then it'll pull up a print box, and basically you can either print it if you have a printer, or you can say save as a PDF, and it'll save it to your computer and your files as a PDF so that you have a copy. And so if you have any questions about that, feel free to contact Maddie or I or anyone from the Southwest Climate Hub. And yes, you will be able to access the workbook after this workshop at any time. You can always log back in and find your project, and you can tweak it or save it or add to it as you would like to in the future. But this is just one way to make sure that you have a saved copy at the end of this course. And so for next time, what we're asking is that you complete the monitoring step 5 for monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of your actions, complete the homework, and then there is an optional reading if you're interested. It's very focused on forest inventory and analysis, monitoring data. So it might be useful to some of you, it might not be to others. So that's just an option if you're interested in learning more. And then next week, we are meeting on Tuesday, March 9th, and we're really going to focus on communication concepts and tips for really thinking about discussing climate change with your partners and networks. And then we're also going to have a discussion on the monitoring ideas that you come up with over the next week as well. And so the communication lecture is going to be really helpful because the last week of this course, now that you've gone through all 5 steps, is that we'd really like you to share your projects with everyone else. And so we're gonna, if you are interested, we hope that you're willing to present on your project and the 5 steps that you've gone through as a part of this adaptation workbook process. And then if you're interested, we also would love it if you would share your projects with us as demonstration examples for others who are really interested in implementing climate adaptation actions in Hawaii. And so those are some different things we'll talk about next week, but just keep that in the back of your mind as you're wrapping up step 5, is that we really do want you to share your story with us and be able to learn from each other for that last week of the course. And so that's all I have. I saw there were some chats coming through. And if anyone has other questions, feel free to ask them now. Yeah, go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, this may have been known most of the time, but I just had a question in thinking about this. For the monitoring and ideas and evaluation processes, are managers asked to come up with those ideas as something that they know they can implement, or just like an ideal scenario? I'm asking because I know, like, earlier in this class, we talked about trying to identify like gaps of where there are like information or data gaps or need or tool, or, you know, and I know I've been kind of listening on that a little bit, but I'm not sure in thinking about what people might present next week, if they are presenting ideas they know they can do on the ground, or hope they could one day do. And yeah, so just trying to distinguish if it's like an ideal scenario or something they can do.
That's a great question, Heather. I think it really depends on what you all want to present, whether you want to present the new ideas that you're excited to try, or if you want to think about some of those ideas that you want to try but aren't sure and aren't really feasible at this point. As Heather said, we'd love to know that information and where some of those gaps are. We will go through some instructions next week to make it a little bit more clear, but you'll have basically 3 to 5 minutes total for your presentation so that we can make sure that there's enough time for everyone. So it's not too much time, but if you have some of those ideas of things where those gaps are and those far in the future ideas for adaptation actions you'd really like to implement, please do share those with us so that we can keep track. And Heather, do you have other suggestions of how you'd like to capture some of that information?
Not at this moment. So thank you. I'll think about that.
Awesome.
I mean, maybe, you know, I guess maybe when people are, if anybody is going to share a final report on their whole process, it might be identified, you know, in just a summary kind of, or, you know, maybe we can have it as a breakout discussion, but we can talk about that since time is up. We can talk about that later.
Sounds great. Thank you. Yeah, we can continue to think about this before next week as well. Any other questions or comments, concerns, feedback? Awesome. And Maddie put an example in the chat of some of those demonstration projects that we have received after going through these courses. So feel free to check those out as well. But those are definitely just some ideas to throw around of what that can look like. But really, we just want to hear your story and some of your key takeaways from going through this process and suggestions and ideas that you have to share with others who have taken this course. I'm not seeing any other questions. Elliot did put his Star Trek history in the chat, so feel free to check that out if you're wondering what he was talking about with the resistance. And that's all we have for this week. So mahalo for your time again, everyone. We really appreciate it. Thanks for the fantastic discussions this week. And we will see you next Tuesday, March 9th.
Mahalo, everyone. Thanks.
Hello.
See you next time.